The government's rural development policy looks really good on paper, and the Minister has already referred to several success stories. But in some cases, those success stories are very divorced from the reality in lots of towns and villages across West Cork and Ireland. Community after community has to fight and even fundraise for really basic services. In my constituency, villages like Drimoleague and Calekill are being really proactive in seeking infrastructure, basically just to enable children to walk safely to school and older people to walk to the pub or the post office. Really basic stuff that nobody should have to fight and campaign for years. Another example, family resource centres. They're an invaluable amenity. They're a one-stop shop for a lot of vulnerable families and individuals and groups. But centres in towns like Bandon and Skibbereen have been searching for permanent locations for years now and for proper government funding. Some of them had to move 5 times in the space of about 2 years. And then other towns and villages have permanent family resource centres in HSE-owned buildings, for example. There are places across Cork Southwest who will be waiting years for broadband, despite government promises, and even more frustrating is the case, for example, in Riverstick, where there's one estate that doesn't have connection, but the rest of the village does. To give an example of Bandon, a big town with a really growing population all the time, it has one playground, and that's due to an incredible local campaign of a group of parents and the support of the entire community that raised the money to get it. And the same is true for Bantry and Inishannon. Dunmanway is the only town in all of West Cork that has a public swimming pool. So as a result, children are waiting years on waiting lists just to go to swimming classes. The list goes on and on. The state has an obligation to provide these services. It's the least, I think, that people should expect. A sustainable society requires balanced regional development, and this needs to be a social and an economic priority. Successive governments have located a disproportionate amount of our health and education and cultural institutions in the more built-up areas, and this drives a model of development that works against the kind of regional balance required for an Ireland, I think, to thrive on the whole. And while our cities suffer from a shortage of housing and unaffordable rents, many people who would have loved the opportunity to move or return to rural areas can't do it. The Social Democrats prioritise the public provision of services and supports that make life affordable to allow people to fully participate in the society that they live in, including in a rural area. And that's not only about health and social care, but everyday facilities like parks, sports facilities, cycle lanes, public toilets, community centres. They're all social infrastructure, and they enrich and strengthen communities. But we're a long, long way from having all our towns and villages supported by appropriate facilities. I think that the rural policy looks really great on paper, but in no way reflects the reality of life in rural Ireland at the moment. There are several major issues that need to be addressed to help implement these plans. I think firstly, there is a really clear need for joined-up thinking. The rural policy interacts with so many other areas and government departments, but too often those intersections are just absent in practice. For example, the document talks about supporting tourism in rural areas and SME growth, which is obviously really important for lots of rural areas. But there's very little awareness of the challenges faced by businesses in the hospitality sector, for example, but also in other SMEs. So there's some acknowledgement of the rise in operating costs in the context of the policy, but there's nothing about what's being done to address these costs. So like unjustifiable and continually increasing insurance premiums is a major issue for small businesses. But how does this policy interact with financial policy? Does the Minister for Finance understand this is a major challenge for tourism and for hospitality, for creative and recreational sectors? The rural policy says all the right things about supporting these industries, but what is being done to actually address the challenges that they're facing? Caravan parks, hotels, activity centres all face significant insurance costs, especially when compared to the UK and other European countries. Why are insurance companies allowed to charge people so much here? Another operating cost is the transaction fees charged by commercial banks. A significant portion of people pay by card now. I think we can all see that happening. But every time you pay in a cafe or a small family business with a card, it costs them. The banks are imposing these charges on the hospitality sector, but nothing's being done in response to this. Another example I want to draw on is fishing. While the policy refers to the importance of fishing in rural communities, there isn't enough focus on measures that actually do anything, especially for inshore fishing. I've repeatedly raised these challenges in the inshore fishing sector with the Minister for Agriculture, Food and Marine. Significantly, there needs to be far greater investment in public marine infrastructure as identified by the Seafood Task Force. That's really basic things on small piers in our coastal and offshore islands to support fishers locally. Things like slipways, not just piers that drop off. They help families stay in the area and they help support the type of sustainable fishing that we should all be prioritising. But there's insufficient annual investment to maintain public marine infrastructure, not to mention improve it. And both the rural and recently published islands policy need to address that deficit. And then there's things like the ban on pairing in inshore areas that would have a massive impact. But there doesn't seem to be that connection between this policy and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. The second major issue is the fundamental flaw at the centre of how public money is distributed. Schemes are put in place and then communities have to essentially compete against each other to get basic public investment. So currently, the Department of Rural Community Development has a scheme for the construction of new community centres, and that's obviously a really great and welcome scheme, but will inevitably be oversubscribed. So what happens to the communities then who are decided not to be worthy of the funding? Why are they less deserving? When will they get their community centres? Then there is the insistence for projects to be shovel-ready, which is a euphemism for hours, days, weeks of effort and work put in by local volunteers and groups. Why is it so hard to get funding for community projects in Ireland? And then, when the funding is awarded, ministers, government TDs and councillors scramble to announce it to get ahead of each other, sometimes with the implication that they had influence in the decision-making of who got the funding for something like a community centre. This perpetuates systems of clientelism and parish pump politics, which makes some public representatives look good, while communities do all of the work with no guarantee of success. The whole system needs to change. Funding should be awarded based on need. There should be rolling funding instruments with integrated supports. This policy should be underpinned by a multi-year implementation plan where communities can understand what funding will be available and can work towards it with the support of the Department and local authorities. There are two particular examples in Cork Southwest which are worth highlighting under this policy. One, Shannonvale near Clonakilty has been dealing with a wastewater issue for years. Untreated water is entering the Argadine River and the local park due to an old and overflowing tank. I've repeatedly raised this issue with minister after minister. Over a year ago, Minister Darragh O'Brien visited the site, seemed to be promising to fix it, and nothing has happened. For too long, locals have had to put up with this. They've had to fight about it, raise the issue continuously. Irish Water and the Council have a solution which needs funding for the government. It should be as simple as that. The river and the park in Shannonvale should be the heart of the village. It's a tiny little green space in the centre of it that used to be the heart of the community for festivals. It's next to the river where people used to swim, and instead now it's dilapidated with untreated wastewater overflowing in it. I'll never forget in the pandemic, children in that area, when there was the limits on travel, had nowhere to play, no green space. Your rural policy commits to investing in water and wastewater infrastructure to support the development of rural towns and villages. But when will places like the people in Shannonvale actually see the benefit of this? Will they have to fight against each other and rally and lobby, or how will it happen? The other matter that I wanted to raise relates to a bus for young people in Beara. Since September, young people living in Beara, out in the peninsula, have been denied public transport to access education and day services in Bantry. A bus was provided only thanks to St Vincent de Paul and the Beara West Family Resource Centre, as well as personal donations, some from the people who are using the bus out of their disability allowance. The new 232 bus service was supposed to address their needs. It finally happened after a lot of work, but the young people and their families have identified several issues with it already, which will not only impact them, but also people with reduced mobility. For example, there should be a bus stop closer to the hospital and to St Gobin's Further Education and Training Centre. Under the current proposal, students and people going to the hospital will be dropped off at the square. So that's a 20-minute walk from the college. The situation is deeply frustrating for the students who've been fighting since last summer for a proper bus service, in many instances missed educational programmes, days in their classes. The government is aware of the issue, which I've brought up repeatedly in the Dáil and directly with the Ministers for Transport and Disability. I can't understand why this service was not developed in consultation with local people, and in particular, the service users themselves. A strong theme in the rural policy is supporting communities to create their own future, but there was no form of shared decision-making or consultation in this important case, for example, and I'm sure many more. The local link office is doing everything they can, but ultimately the National Transport Authority makes decisions on routes and timetables, and the Minister has to act to support inclusive transport. We're talking about the impacts of the government's rural policy. I think there's a significant gap between this policy and what communities are actually experiencing, and there needs to be a fundamental change to the way the policy is implemented if it's to be in any way successful.
Very many thanks.